In Acts chapter 10, Peter, and you know Peter's story, right? Peter is who? He wasn't, he was Peter the apostle, which means he was what? Yeah, he was one of the 12 disciples, right? And he was a close associate with Jesus during Jesus' earthly ministry, right? Make sense? What was his occupation? What was his ethnic background?
Jewish.
He was a Jew. That's right, he was a fisherman. Excuse me. And he was apparently a good Jew. It was his in the strictest sense, because it was his custom to go to the temple like other Jews did. And even a rather secularized Jew at this point in time who lived in Israel was probably more religious than a lot of religious Americans. So anyway, here's Peter, and he's a Jew, and he's a fisherman, and he happens to be one who was chosen by Jesus himself to be a disciple, to be one of his assistants, if you will, a friend of Jesus in a very personal and literal sense. Jesus is our friend too. Peter and Jesus' relationship, he's very close to Jesus during Jesus' earthly ministry. They have a rapport. Peter says the dumbest things, and Jesus always restores him and understands, and he helps him to get past his own biases, prejudices, etc., etc. But when the church first starts, you remember when the church was born, it was that day of Pentecost. It was when the Holy Spirit was poured out, and the disciples, the Holy Spirit descended upon them in power, and it looked like flames of fire upon them. You remember? And they began to speak in the tongues of the people who were gathered there from all over the earth. And people were responding to the gospel, the invitation to know God through Jesus Christ. And Peter was there. But even all of those people were pretty much Jewish by background. So, as far as the disciples know, in the very earliest days of the church, the gospel was for the Jews. Now, Jesus didn't actually say that, because he tells them they're going to go to the ends of the earth and so forth. And Jesus never said it was just for the Jew. We have to be very clear on that. But they just assumed that. They just assumed that. And they were pretty much, being Jews, still bound by their understanding of the Jewish law. They still had to do things the Jewish way, and as far as their feasts and do what? Their dietary rules and so forth. In Acts chapter 10, though, things change very radically. The gospel, it's so powerful, so big, that it's not intended for just a family of believers, or a group of believers, a nation. It's intended by God to go to all the nations of the earth, right? So, God has to do a work in the mindset, in the prejudices of that early church. Even the early church had its prejudices. Okay? And so, there is, in Acts chapter 10, a record for us how God dealt with that prejudice, how he dealt with overturning the preconceived ideas of the people who were called the people of God. And I'm going to give you just a summary, basically up to a point. I'm just going to summarize most of chapter 10 for you at the moment. Then we're going to read a few passages in particular. But take your time when you have some time to read this, and read through, because it's amazing how God does this. But basically, Peter has a vision. Okay? What is it you know about Jews and food? They have what is called a kosher diet, right? What does that mean?
It's clean.
Yeah, it's clean. They have very strict rules on what they can eat and what they can't eat, right? And how food is even prepared is very important. God uses this particular thing because it's such a big deal to a typical Jew. And Peter has a vision, and basically the bottom line is that God tells Peter in the vision, go and eat of all these food, all these things, all these animals and things like that. God says, go and eat those things. Peter says, oh, I can't eat that. That's unclean. God says, don't call unclean what I have made clean. And Peter's trying, and then he comes out of his vision. He's this encounter with God, and he's trying to decide, what does this mean? Is this just about the food? Is this about food? But do you know something? It wasn't about food, really. It was the first step in overcoming some of Peter's prejudices about how God works and how God moves and what God would require. And it was going to be God's way of preparing him for something even bigger than anything to do with food. And that was the presentation of the gospel to the Gentile world. Paul is called a missionary to the Gentiles because as he preached to Jews, they kept throwing stones at him and trying to kill him and running him out of town and beating him up and that sort of thing. So he became the apostle to the Gentiles. He took the gospel to the Gentiles. But this is actually when the gospel was first presented. It wasn't Paul, it was Peter. This was the first presentation officially of the gospel to the Gentile world. So in chapter 10, basically, again, just kind of summing up a little bit, a messenger comes to Peter while he's trying to figure out this vision, and it's a messenger from, some of you know this story, from a centurion. Who were the centurions? They were elite guards of the Roman Empire, and they weren't Jewish. In fact, they were people who basically held in oppression the people of Judea. They were the oppressors of the Jews. They were the guys who enforced if you will, basically the slavery of the Israelites. So the Israelites didn't really like them much, okay? And not only that, they weren't Jewish, and so they weren't supposed to go and associate with them, because the things of their households were unclean, and if a Jew went into the household of an unclean person, they were rendered unclean and could not participate in the worship of God in the temple. So they didn't hang out with them either. They didn't eat with them. They certainly didn't eat with them, because eating together is sharing more than just a physical kind of fellowship, but a spiritual kind of fellowship. It represented that. So anyway, a messenger comes to Peter and says, hey, my boss says you need to come to our house and help him out with some things, understand some things. And Peter, having come out of that vision, basically says, okay, I'll do that. Because he knows God is doing something. He knows that God is at work. God didn't just send him this vision just because he was talking to him about how he was going to change his menu, but how he was going to change the world.